Foster, and I work at Phelps Stokes. And welcome to the palaver hut. Just a little footnote on the idea. For those of you who have lived and worked in West Africa, you have seen over the years the institution of the palaver hut as a vehicle and an arena for establishing peace. Quite frankly, it's where you go to talk. And while in general it's mostly men who go there to talk, it's generally men who get into fights. You talk until you have consensus. And you can call that a process of consultation or torture, but it has a way of mitigating some of the usual conflicts that often emerge in communities undergoing stress and change. Conflicts that can easily, with new weapons, become devastating. And I don't need to tell our colleagues here from Halo that when you start creating mines, that has enormous consequences for people and the quality of life in a community. So the idea of a palaver hut, it would be a place where you could come at least to talk about differences. But most importantly, in the process of talking about differences, two things happen. One, you begin to make explicit, hopefully to yourself, but to other people, your own theories of causation. How do you think the world works? Okay? And you'd be amazed that we don't question our questions. We don't question our thinking. Whether it's public policy or whether it's private initiatives. You'd be amazed at the decisions that are made on unquestioned assumptions, okay, and messes that are created because no one bothered to really say, why are we posing this question? What are the assumptions behind the question? What are the values? How did you come to know that? And of course what we're learning is that, in fact, epistemology has something to do with living. Where you grew up and what time of childhood you had, that has as much effect on how you interpret reality as where you got your degree. What that says is that the more you get to know somebody and how they think and feel, the easier it's going to be for you to resolve conflict and find points of collaboration. And that's really what a palaver hut should be. The question for the 21st century is that how do you make that electronic, virtual? But it begins in rooms like this, where human beings sit down and take a topic and have a discussion that is respectful, that is candid, that is courageous. The value of these conversations are at least in two areas. One, hopefully one of you will meet somebody that you haven't met before. You know? Or you may get to know somebody you thought you knew, now you get to know them a little bit more. The second value is beginning to develop networks. And unfortunately, today we may be talking about demining. Tomorrow it may be malaria. The day after tomorrow it may be some other catastrophe or problem. We will have those problems. But the question will be, can we develop the spirit of sharing, the spirit of working together that allows us to make some progress towards resolving the issues. And I think that is what a larger number of people are yearning for. Quite frankly, that's where our institutions and leaders are failing us, because they're not providing simple ways by which everyday people can engage in palaver. So, with that sort of whip-up speech, what we want to do is to listen carefully to the issues embedded in the demining of communities and its implications for education. We've assembled some very, very smart people here. In the spirit of palaver hut, all of this happens because everybody brings something. Somebody brought ideas, some people brought food, whatever. Certainly Melissa and the staff who did the organizing of this, we thank them. But the whole spirit is that if we can quietly sort of bring it together, no burden falls on any one individual. And as we like to say at Phelps Stokes, everybody knows something and nobody knows everything. And everybody knows somebody and nobody knows everybody. So if we can find some way in the space of the next hour or so to create an ambiance, a sentiment of sharing, we'll all be much richer for it as human beings, but more importantly, in terms of the issues that we are going to be discussing. So as we get into the question, answer period discussion, if you have ideas about things that ought to be pursued related to the topic, toss them out. Nobody's going to know they're there unless you toss them out, and then we'll harvest them and we'll see which ones we can work with. So on that note, let me turn this over to our mistress of ceremonies, our boss. I'm glad to see some old friends. I've got senior fellows here that are in Legion, so Phelps Stokes is well represented, and I'm eager to meet our friends from HALO and other organizations. And I will now turn this over to Edwina Levy, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I want to thank everyone and welcome everyone for coming today. I'm Edwina and I'm the program coordinator with HALO. HALO is a humanitarian demining organization. We're the largest and the first of its kind. And my purpose for bringing us together today is A, to discuss demining, but also from our experiences on the field, we've noticed that a disproportionate amount of the accident victims happen to be children. They're the ones who are more inquisitive than adults, and they're the ones that are going to see something shiny and pick it up, and as such an accident may occur. We have Andrew Lyons from HALO, Miss Bethany Winder, and also Chime Sonia with us today. And they're going to speak to their expertise, and we will discuss demining for everyone here. Miss Bethany will carry on the education platform, and Mr. Sonia is here to represent the young and truly transatlantic African-American citizens of today and how we can use the skills and assets that we've had on this side of the Atlantic to effect change and lasting change on the other side. We'll begin with Andrew Lyons, and Andrew Lyons is the Vice President of HALO Trust. He was based in the field on HALO operations for 4 years before transferring to the U.S. In Afghanistan, he was Senior Operations Officer in charge of 2,800 demining and weapons disposal staff from 2005 to 2007. And in Angola, he was Program Finance Officer from 2003 to 2005. Although formerly based in the U.S., he spent much of 2008 to 2009 starting up HALO's new program in Colombia, as well as helping to relaunch Ryan Clarence in Kosovo. Prior to joining HALO, he was a financial analyst in Chicago and a Peace Corps volunteer in Lithuania and Bosnia. Andrew holds a BA in economics from the University of Chicago and is currently pursuing a master's in finance from Johns Hopkins University. Andrew has lectured on landmines, Afghanistan security, and international development to audiences throughout the United States and Canada.
And my favorite color is blue.
And gray.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Miss Bethany Dickerson Winder. Winder.
Thank you.
Sorry. Ms. Winder is the director of the Ralph Bunche Societies at Phelps Stokes, a nonprofit organization located in Washington, D.C. Winder's responsibilities include developing and supporting Ralph Bunche Societies at colleges and universities throughout the United States and abroad. The Ralph Bunche Societies are extracurricular undergraduate student-led associations dedicated to developing globally aware citizens from all fields of study. The societies encourage students to embrace the life work, legacy, and values of Dr. Bunche by emphasizing scholarly excellence, language, proficiency, cultural awareness, community service, and activism, as well as professional and leadership development. Prior to joining Phelps Stokes, Winder builds and maintains relationships with representatives of private foundations while working as a grant writer in the Development Fundraising Division of the New York Public Library, 13 WNET New York, and the District of Columbia Public Schools. In addition, Winder spent 4 years as a public advisor with the United States Senate Democratic Policy Committee. While at DPC, she worked on a range of domestic policy issues, including education. Winder earned a Master's of Public Policy degree from Georgetown University and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Government from the University of Virginia. She also has participated in numerous professional and leadership development workshops and conferences that have focused on enhancing fundraising skills. Winder has studied abroad in Japan and Great Britain. She and her family have hosted exchange students from Japan, Paraguay, and Liberia. In addition to living in Japan and Great Britain, Winder has traveled to Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, France, Ireland, Jamaica, Spain, St. Thomas, Tortola, the Virgin Borda. Winder has taken courses in Spanish, a language in which she hopes to become fluent. She's an active member of the Ron Brown Scholar Program Steering Committee in Rhodes, Alumni Association, and Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Winder also serves as a volunteer for the Breakthrough Cambridge, an education nonprofit organization located in Massachusetts. And last but not least, we have Chime Sonye.
Put me behind them. Supposed to be the young one?
Yes, young and sage. Chime Sonye of Chicago, Illinois is a program assistant for Uganda, Zimbabwe, and South Africa portfolio in the Africa Division of the International Republican Institute. A core institute of the National Endowment for Democracy, IRI is a government-funded, nonpartisan organization working to support and strengthen democratic institutions worldwide. With IRI, Chime has facilitated the Advocacy, Transparency, and Human Rights panel at President Obama's Forum with Young African Leaders, and is currently an election observer for the Southern Sudanese independence referendum in the diaspora. In the past, Mr. Sonye has worked and interned with the United States Agency for International Development, Development Alternatives, Permanent Mission of Nigeria to the United Nations, and House Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health. Sonye received a bachelor's degree in political science and philosophy from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. There he was elected as a student member on the University of Illinois Board of Trustees and granted as a Chancellor's Scholar. The Governor of Illinois gave Sonye the executive appointment to have an official legal vote on the board. Having a strong academic debate background, Sonye was named an All-American Debater in 2007 by the Cross-Examination Debate Association and presently serves on the Youth Professional Leadership Board of the National Association for Urban Debate League.
That's pretty good.
I'm done all right in these early 20s like that.
Yes. So, without further ado, I give you Andrew Lyons.
Thank you very much, Edwina. Welcome. In early 2002, just under 9 years ago, in Angola, Joseph Savimbi, the head of UNITA, was shot and killed by MPLA soldiers. Shortly thereafter, his key lieutenants materialized and surrendered, and less than 3 months later, the war was brought to a formal close. The Civil War had lasted 27 years, so an entire generation had known nothing but the war. But now it was over. Sort of. Because in the following year, what happened was that 287 deaths were recorded, or casualties were recorded from these things, from landmines. It was after the war. Those were the official statistics. Unofficial statistics or estimates go, double or triple that. These are the culprits. More these than these in Angola. These are anti-tank mines. But a plain old car will set them off, and you'll always have multiple casualties. Certainly a truck will set these off. These are anti-personnel mines, which will take out one person or one person's leg. What we know from the official statistics were that 68% of those casualties in 2002 were civilian, and 26% were children. So, in one sense, the war ended for the soldiers only, and it kept going on for the civilians. So what happened at the end of the war? Well, peace broke out everywhere. people were very happy. There was the national mood was very, very high. Commerce restarted. People started to return to their homes that they hadn't been for years. They brought their families back. Commercial activity restarted. People started driving on roads that hadn't been used for decades because there were front lines that had divided them. And then all these accidents started happening. And particularly on the roads with trucks trying to move products from one place to another, it became a crisis proportions. International aid had swarmed on the country after the war, and by late 2002, by the rainy season, September, October, November, aid agencies had brought to a halt aid activities in parts of Angola that were in the most need of aid. And they basically said, we can't go any further when, we're seeing accidents happen all the time. A major international aid agency lost 6 staff in an accident. That was sort of the trigger event. And that's when they kind of hauled Halo Trust into a meeting and surrounded our senior management team and said, you have to solve this problem, and you have to solve it fast, because we're not going to deliver aid if you don't do it. So what we did then at the beginning of this period of peace was to try to come up with some way to solve the problem of these. By the way, these are plastic. These aren't the exact mine type that's found in Angola, but close enough. They're made out of plastic. Very, very hard to find with a metal detector, which is the normal way we find things. And we're talking about tens of thousands of miles with a low-density plastic anti-tank mine threat. How do you find them, and how do you prioritize? Where do you start? How do you deal with make the roads safe for people? And Kurt, if you could throw up the first slide. Here's a sort of solution that we came up with, which was not perfect. We don't call it full clearance. It's not a way to assure 100% that the mines are gone, but it's systematic search at a reasonable speed. And it was basically improvised that year in 2002. And you can see this vehicle up on the top. On the front of it, it's got a large metal detector, which you can see better in the shadow that it casts on the ground. And the vehicle itself is a heavy vehicle, but it's got those very thick tires, which spread its ground pressure down, so that at any given square inch, there's not enough ground pressure to initiate an anti-tank mine, in theory. In case the theory doesn't hold true, there's also armoring underneath in a V shape to deflect explosion. Wouldn't be good for the vehicle, but the operator would survive if it initiated the mine. Now that's to get metal anti-tank mines, but a lot of these were plastic. So there's a rear view. I don't know if everyone can see it. In the rear view, it's dragging heavy trailers with weights stacked on top of them, basically, for anything that was missed, any plastic mines, to sort of just drag over and initiate them. And the idea is each of these wheels are called sacrificial. They have a shear pin that blow one wheel off. It doesn't destroy the vehicle. You can replace it, but you've gotten rid of the mine. This solution, or it's a way to address the problem, not really to solve it, but as you can see, the results over the next few years, we covered a lot of ground. A year later, the next rainy season, we'd only started. That was my first rainy season in Angola, and by my count, I was sort of keeping a horrified count of what was going on. There was about one a week in major accident on anti-tank mines somewhere in the country, and they all had multiple casualties. It was a crisis of incredible proportions. It's like the war hadn't ended. So, the broader picture of mines. That's how mines continue to fight the war after the war is over. Mines impact on every single aspect of reconstruction and development in a country. People, first of all, returning to their homes where they haven't been. Now they have a mines threat. They don't know where the mines are because they've been displaced by the war. So simply going back to their homes, let alone rebuilding their homes, poses a threat. Agriculture, subsistence agriculture, is what most people in Angola depend in whole or in part on for their subsistence. And that is an activity that's horribly fraught with danger in an area, in a country that's as mined as Angola is. Education, schools, come back to schools in a bit, but going to get water becomes a very dangerous exercise. So mines are pervasive everywhere, or they, in terms of their impact. They aren't pervasive all over the country, but their impact is pervasive on all these aspects of reconstruction and development. Now, I'm not an education expert. I will defer to Bethany and Chibe to talk about education themes later, but I will say two things about mines and education. One is specific to Angola, and that is, it's a country of 12 million people, spread out over a huge, in theory, spread over a huge country, twice the size of Texas. But currently a third of those 12 million people live in Luanda. And that's just because of the war. It became the safest place. So many internally displaced persons went to move to the capital city, which was never built to sustain more than 500,000 people. And so the sort of byros and slums that built up in and around Luanda simply don't have the infrastructure. Very many children don't go to school. And the schools that do exist are overcrowded, under-resourced. The second point on mines and education is more general, that we find in most post-war countries that we work in. Schools make really good military posts. And so they very often are used as military posts. And the reason they make good military posts is because they have a big building with 1 or 2 large rooms in it that can house many soldiers. And they usually have a flat area in front, playground, which can be used to park military vehicles. So during a war, in many countries, you will find schools get taken over by soldiers, and then landmines are laid around the school to protect the post. When the war's over, usually the soldiers don't come back and dig up their mines. So they make schools a particularly hazardous area right after war. The news isn't all bad in Angola. If you fast forward to 2009, there were 28 casualties. So 287 officially recorded ones in 2002, 28 casualties in 2009. Tremendous progress on the surface, but there's good news and bad news to that. The good news is that people are getting a lot more savvy about avoiding the minefields. They know where they are. There's still a lot of mines in Angola. We're making progress in removing them. HALO and other agencies making progress in removing them, but a lot of the reduction in casualties goes to people learning the hard way about where the mines are and avoiding communities learning the hard way through their own tragic history. The bad news is a lot of minefields still remain in Angola, and they're having a socioeconomic impact. They're dragging on recovery, every aspect of recovery still. People can't farm their land in safety. People can't drive, bring their product to market on the roads in safety. People can't rebuild. The government can't rebuild infrastructure. Although they are making great progress in Angola on roads and water, but the mines are always there, dragging progress down and adding casualties into the mix. That's the story in Angola. On its way, if you go across the continent to the east to Mozambique, they are 10 years ahead, and they got a 10-year head start, and they are definitely 10 years ahead in their progress. The blue area out there, the 4 northern provinces, are completely mine impact free, and they have been since 2007. 1994 to 2007, 13 years and $30 million. That's the cost to make a province that had over 100,000 mines in place in it mine free. But the upshot is every single community has been visited. Every single community has pointed out whatever remaining dangerous areas they thought there were, and they've been dealt with, and they all feel completely safe in getting on with their lives, and they are getting on with their lives. Although it's still a very poor region in general, there are lots of economic activities happening. Niassa in particular, tourism is returning, and Mozambique's on its way. Southern Mozambique is also on its way economically, but unfortunately it still has a big mines problem. When we closed our operation in 2007 in the north, we moved it down to the south, and we're working there. A couple other agencies are working there too. And shockingly, within an hour's drive of Maputo, the capital, you can still find active minefields that are threatening people. In Mozambique, these are more the culprit. If you can show the next slide, Kurt. Anti-personnel mines which threaten individuals. So up the photo on the left is an electricity pylon. There's a whole sort of string of pylons that go across a big swath of the country to deliver electricity, and they were all mined by the government to protect them during the war, to protect them from sabotage. Now, those communities that are built up around these pylons, and the mines all need to be removed, and they're in the process of being removed. And lots of casualties have occurred around these areas, and certainly there have been blockages to people conducting farming. Over the right is much more inland. It's called Tet province, where there are still very, very densely laid mine belts near Kahora Bassa Dam, which are impacting 11 communities and really bisecting the communities, and including paths to water, etc. So that's sort of the poorest of the poor inland in Kahora Bassa. Also of interest in Mozambique is its border with Zimbabwe. Kurt, if you could show the next slide. Zimbabwe is a place that we've been starting to look at recently, and it's got one of the, as it turns out, one of the largest minefields remaining in the world. And the impact on the Zimbabwe side is even greater than the impact on the Mozambique side. My colleague Kurt, just can't talk about this without talking about my colleague Kurt there, who actually walked the entire border doing the survey. So I don't want to, I'm nervous that he'll correct me if I say something wrong. But Zimbabwe is a huge impact, and this is people's homes and outhouses, let alone agriculture, are abutting the minefields and impacting every daily aspect of their lives, let alone education. If you can do the next slide. We go over to Somaliland. Somaliland, it's back to these anti-tank lines. It's a big desert. I don't want to be politically incorrect and say country, but statelet region, whatever you want to call it. It's a bastion of stability in the Horn of Africa, but it has had a very large anti-tank line problem, and the sandy tracks throughout Somaliland sort of shift over time, and nobody really knows where some of these roads, original roads, were. Therefore, nobody really knows where the original minefields were. However, making great progress, and we think in about certainly in 5 years, we hope, fingers crossed, we're going to be done in Somaliland. We'll be completely mine-free. And next slide, please, Kurt. The upshot. Here's one happy story. Very near to Hargeisa, where an area that we cleared, UNICEF then came in and built a school. And this is exactly the type of partnerships that we like to have. We like to clear something, and then somebody else comes in and adds value, and then development can really have a multiplier effect. Other African countries have mines problems too. The four that I just sort of highlighted are probably the four biggest. Eritrea still has a significant mines problem. Sudan has a mines problem yet to be quantified, probably much smaller than these other countries. Sudan certainly has other issues going on right now, but more information may emerge over time. There are many countries in Africa that are touched by minefields and landmines, but to a varying degree. Actually, Senegal, Casamance would be an example of a place that we don't have any organizational experience with, but it's very likely one that has a significant mines problem. We'll be learning more about it in the future. In general, in all cases, mines are just sort of a stubborn impediment to everything else that you want to do to rebuild a country after a war, including education. In no case will clearing the mines, in none of these development problems, none of the development problems will be solved without by clearing the minefields. On the other hand, none of the development problems will be fully solved without clearing the minefields. And that's where these kinds of overlaps occur. That's sort of an overview on landmines and their impact on development in Africa.
Thank you, Andrew. A brief addendum. Again, my name is Bethany Dickerson-Winder, and I'm the former director of Ralph Bunche Societies at Phelps Stokes, and I'm currently working at City Year headquarters in Boston, which is an education and service-owning nonprofit organization. And a lot of the work that I was doing at Phelps Stokes is really an extension in terms of the work that I'm doing now. And I just wanted to thank you, Phelps Stokes, and the Halo Trust for inviting me to present on the impact of demining on children's education in Africa. I'm honored to be here with all of you, and to engage in an important discussion on human rights, and a very important human rights topic. And I'm especially pleased to be here today because of my personal mission to engage in work that creates greater education, leadership, and service learning opportunities for people in the African diaspora. So that is the spirit in which I come to present today. First, I'd like to address the distortions caused by demining to the education of African children. According to the Mine Action Information Center, due to numerous internal conflicts, as we heard Andrew allude to earlier, crises and wars that several of the nations in Africa have faced, the region is one of the places in the world that has been significantly impacted by landmines. And more specifically, landmines have disrupted the education of youth and young adults, as we all know. And as with any societal disruption, the need to rebuild community is great. So I am not here today to drill down on education statistics. However, I would like to share some ideas about ways to empower emerging and seasoned leaders in Africa to enhance life through the formation of learning communities. Building on the spirit that Dr. Foster mentioned in terms of the spirit of sharing. At this juncture, a definition of learning communities may be helpful. Peter Msengi, author of The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of a Learning Organization, defines a learning community or learning organization as a community that is continually expanding its capacity and its ability to create its future. For such a community, it is not enough to merely survive. Msengi is clear that he is not talking about learning merely in terms of survival. In the context of building learning communities, we're concerned with creating a culture of generative learning. A culture of generative learning is one where we're focused on enhancing our capacity to create. And I think it's probably relevant to turn to learning communities as an important way to foster community building. Msengi would probably recommend that emerging leaders pursue disciplines, and by that I mean developmental paths for acquiring certain skills or competencies that enhance their capacity to realize their highest aspirations. He focuses on five key components: systems thinking, personal mastery, mental models, building shared vision, and team learning. Systems thinking is essentially this holistic and integrated approach to understanding the world around you. One can only understand the system of a rainstorm by contemplating the whole, not any individual part of the pattern. Personal mastery is this whole idea of the discipline of continually clarifying and deepening our personal vision, of focusing our energies, of developing patience, and of seeing reality objectively, a learning community's spiritual foundation. Third, mental models. Deeply ingrained assumptions, generalizations, or pictures or images that influence how we understand the world and how we take action. Along those lines, working with mental models includes the ability to engage in conversations that balance inquiry and advocacy, where people expose their own thinking effectively and make that thinking open to the influence of others. Building a shared vision. This is the act of binding people together around a common identity and sense of identity. When there is a genuine vision, people excel and learn, not because they're told to do so, but because they generally want to. And fifth, team learning. And this is this whole idea of the discipline of team learning, starting with dialogue. Dr. Foster alluded to that earlier today. The capacity of members of a team to suspend assumptions and enter into a genuine thinking together. While I mentioned systems thinking first, it really is the fifth discipline, because it is the discipline that integrates the disciplines, fusing them into a coherent body of theory and practice. Systems thinking makes understandable the subtlest aspect of the learning organization or community, the new way individuals perceive themselves and their world. And at the heart of the learning organization or learning community is a shift of mind. From seeing ourselves as separate from the world to connected to the world. From seeing problems as caused by someone or something out there to seeing how our own actions create the problems that we experience. And a learning organization or community is a place where people are continually discovering how they create their reality and how they can change it. The learning community approach can be used to foster community and ongoing learning in multiple contexts. It is also helpful because it creates the capacity to develop a leadership pipeline in communities. Learning is an important component of leading, and I think that many of us often forget that. And the learning community frame helps us to promote group learning and individual mastery in the context of enhancing community building. At this point, it's important to turn to this idea of learning as a way of learning as a way of leading. And according to Stephen Preskill and Stephen D. Brookfield, who are the authors of Learning as a Way of Leading, Lessons from the Struggle for Social Justice, many actual community and organizational leaders share a commitment to leading through learning. Their success as learning leaders is dependent on a number of dispositions, capacities, and public practices. And the 9 learning tasks of leadership include learning how to be open to the contributions of others, learning how to reflect critically on one's practice, a social learning process in which perceptions and interpretations of others are crucial. Only if one is open to the contributions of others can one gather their perspectives needed to practice critical reflection. Third, learning how to support the growth of others. In terms of what we wish for those whom we serve, the enhanced capacity for them to learn is paramount. Fourth, learning how to develop collective leadership. Collective leadership flows from a culture in which engagement in and sharing of learning is an expectation and a priority. Once we see that the collective is the source of so much of our learning, our strength, and our identity, it is but a step to realizing that leadership also resides in the collective. When our perception of learning as an individual phenomenon changes to one of learning as a group process, then the idea that leadership is like learning, something that moves around the community and is dependent on the involvement of others, becomes commonplace. Fifth, learning how to analyze experience. And I think that one of the most difficult dimensions of this task, and the authors would argue, is that when its practice leads us to challenge old assumptions and then to reconfigure accepted practices. 6, learning how to question oneself and others. What is learned one day is used the next as a bridge to considering a new set of understandings and challenges. 7, learning democracy, honoring diversity, live with the partial functioning of the democratic ideal, and develop collective forms of social and economic planning. And the last 2, learning to sustain hope in the face of struggle, and learning to create community. Emerging leaders can seek to build community and teach the value of community-based decision-making and leadership. Building communities in which the members of those communities are authentically empowered to make important decisions for themselves and their neighbors remains a chief objective of the work of leaders who learn. And now I'd like to focus a bit on the ethics and moral leadership, which I believe are often overlooked when it comes to forming learning communities. And I think this ethical component of fostering the environment for building communities, such as what we're doing right now and with groups that we work with, and ongoing learning is often, again, missing or overlooked. Professor Cornell Mencken is helpful in thinking through the ethical component. And the 6 elements of the conceptual framework of moral leadership include belief in the essential nobility of human nature, service-oriented leadership, the purpose of leadership, personal and social transformation, the moral responsibility of investigating and applying truth, transcendence, and finally the development of capabilities, or concepts, skills, attitudes, and qualities. And I'd like to introduce a model for consideration and toss it out on the table. And this is the Phelps Stokes Ralph Bunche Societies. And this is specifically one example of combining aspects of learning community, leading while learning, and moral leadership. And as you heard earlier, the Ralph Bunche Societies are an example of a learning community on college campuses. Phelps Stokes has engaged not only in building the societies or these student-led organizations, but more importantly, the societies are learning communities. Many students, faculty, community activists have come together in different spaces and identified issues of concern, activities of importance to them in their network and in their context, and collaborated on a variety of different projects to essentially make an impact on the world and on their college campuses. They've engaged in dialogue on different policy issues, participated in hands-on projects, and participated in conferences. And as they engaged in this work, they formed learning communities. These activities can take place beyond the college campus, such as in civic spaces where demining is taking place. For example, churches, men's and women's clubs, and maybe organizations that serve children. Second, I'd like to highlight Phelps Stokes' experience with Ralph Bunche Societies and how they inform us about how we should use our resources with regard to the education of youth and young adults. You know, a portion of resources should be invested in the development of leadership societies or programs that would do 5 things. Identify, nurture, and develop emerging leaders. 2, advance social justice through excellence in education, leadership development, and service learning. 3, increase global awareness and orientation. 4, facilitate global networking opportunities to strengthen networks of leaders. And 5, transform communities through partnerships. And based on what I've just shared with all of you, there are some program assumptions that I think would be helpful to point out, and that would be that leadership development is critical for the advancement of minority and working class emerging leaders throughout the African diaspora. Emerging leaders need new skills and competencies to effectively respond to new global realities and challenges. Capacity building and expansion of new generations and networks of leaders are critical factors for community transformation. And that's essentially what we're talking about here, is community transformation and how can we rebuild community after experiencing and managing this whole issue around demining. Moral and ethical leadership training models are needed to sufficiently equip emerging leaders in the Americas and Africa for transformational community change in different contexts. And institutional partnerships are critical to long-term sustainability of leadership societies or programs. And Ralph Bunche Societies often use their resources to implement global leadership activities, which have included personal and moral and ethical leadership development workshops, webinars, blogs, intergroup leadership seminars, community building and reconciliation workshops, global education and leadership conferences, and service learning. And third and finally, I would like to submit to all of you as other considerations. Question, you know, how and what should be done to strengthen whatever educational capacities are present via emerging leaders and community heads? And I didn't get paid to say this, but I'm going to share an idea from Dr. Foster. And I can recall Dr. Foster suggesting that Tanzania represents an impressive collective effort by leaders from all sectors to dramatically increase their capacity for social and economic growth by fashioning a broad and comprehensive strategy for massive investments in the universal education of its youth, its future. A recent 5-year goal to build 3,000 new schools was accomplished within 3 years by the engagement of community and civil society sectors. The projected shortage of some 100,000 secondary school teachers has led to the design of an awe-inspiring teacher training strategy that leverages information communication technologies via e-learning. The adoption of a national education strategy by all government ministries signals the broad support of leaders in all segments and sectors of society. This in turn has provided a platform for linking donor assistance to domestic goals established by Tanzanians in an open, transparent, and accountable manner. Another idea, engage in co-production. Again, the source of language is from Dr. Foster, and Edgar Kahn's pioneering work with the concept of co-production and its application via time banks provides a clear strategy for linking the monetary and core economies in the service of social and economic progress that honors all participants. And the elements of co-production include treating the individual as an asset rather than a burden in the development process, using peer support networks along with professionals as the best means of transferring knowledge and capabilities, clouding the distinctions between producers and consumers of service so that people get to act in both roles. And by that I mean as providers as well as recipients, and presenting those involved with a range of rewards which help embed the key elements of reciprocity and mutuality. The decline of social capital in countries that have experienced civil war or ethnic tribal conflict constitutes a barrier to social progress, peace, and stability. What is the source of social capital? Social capital is rooted in a social economy whose centers are the household, the neighborhood, the community, and civil society. The core economy is rebuilt and revitalized through the practice of co-production. Co-production is an antidote to the commodification of life by all sectors of the monetary economy. It dramatically supplements the public welfare delivery systems aimed at community building from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays. And the development of core economies via co-production throughout Africa will avoid the tendency to restrict development assistance to paid professionals or to volunteers functioning as free labor within the silos of non-governmental organizations. And this choice of strategy, Dr. Foster would say is more likely to honor rather than humiliate all those who seek to build a future where relationships of mutuality, trust, and engagement are built upon speaking, listening, caring, and authentic respect. By contrast, the distribution and access to public benefits generated by development assistance are grounded upon negatives and deficiencies. For example, what one lacks, what disability one may have, what misfortune has befallen, then the more likely that the development assistance will contribute to the eventual humiliation of its stakeholders. And in the first instance, the choice is to be made in Africa, by Africans, and for Africans. Those who care deeply will look to Africa's leaders to point the way. And in conclusion, while landmines continue to have a devastating effect on people decades after they were planted, healthy alternatives do exist to minimize the negative impact of landmines and promote educational opportunities. Fostering learning communities would facilitate forging effective and sustainable relationships. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again. My name is Chime Sonye from IRI. I'd like to thank HALO, Phelps Stokes Society, also my colleague Lauren Owen for accompanying me here from IRI. And also like to thank Dr. Foster because I can tell you're a true Africanist and Chicagoanist. Not only did you thank everybody here, but you thank the people who brought the food. Very important. I appreciate that. I think that what you said is very important in terms of this being a space for questions, values, and how we come to know certain issues. And I bring my perspective on landmines and education, not as part of my organization, but really as a member of the diaspora, thinking through how I can tackle some of these issues. So this is a really interesting for me opportunity to have this thought experiment from one of these challenging issues that currently confront us. Last night I went home and I talked to my roommate, who's also like me, young guy. We went to college together, and I said I was going to be on a panel on landmines. And he said, "Landmines? What are those?" And I was like,
You want to borrow one?
I didn't have the demonstration, the piece, but I said they're, things, anti-personal mines that blow up, kill people. And he said, "Do those things really just still exist?" And this is a smart guy right now. If you guys know him, he's not here, so not disparaging anybody, but smart guy. But this is really, I think that this is the mindset right now for youth and young people when we're thinking about these issues. We don't even know that landmines exist. And my conception of why we don't know is we think that the challenges that currently confront us, that are very important right now, are connected to the idea of extinction or apocalypse. This is mine, and I'll explain. When we think that the important challenges of our day are things like nuclear war, nuclear threats, we think about the Enough Project and genocide, And you can see right now what's being debated in Congress, the START Treaty. That was the big thing, mutually assured destruction between Russia and etc. We think about AIDS, PEPFAR, and the kind of like the idea and the representations of pandemics. I think this is where we think about apartheid, and this is where we capture that. These are the things that kind of capture our public imagination, especially for young individuals. Landmines, we don't think about because we don't really connect it to the idea of distinction. We understand that maybe it may hurt rebuilding and reconstruction efforts, but we don't think about it in the context of some of these other larger challenges. But I think that landmines is something that we should focus on and we should care about. And the first reason why is systematic deaths, and I think that this was gone into earlier today. Steve Mannon and Eddie Kallner write in their 2006 article, Landmines, Injuries and Overview, that every 20 minutes, landmines claims another victim. 80 to 90% of them are non-combatants. All told, 26,000 to 28,000 people are killed or maimed annually, a statistic that has not really declined in years. So every 20 minutes, in this 2006 article, a person is dying is a landmine victim. And also according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, every 25 minutes someone around the world steps on a landmine. These statistics are really bad, but the problem, as talked about earlier, is unique for Africans, and the diaspora and Africans should be uniquely concerned. Africa remains one of the most heavily mined continents, and there continues to be devastation and a daily reality of violence in many sub-Saharan African countries. By one source, 22 sub-Saharan African countries still lack the resources to combat this, and which is a product of results of wars that are still going on and product of proxy wars like the two Cold Wars before. But if you compare this to other continents, 15 countries in Asia, 11 in Europe, 9 in Latin America, we can see Africa is one of the most heavily mined continents. So when we're thinking about the terms of the debate and why we should care about it, it's important. But I think that another reason it's neglected vis-a-vis some of these other issues like nuclear war, genocide, etc., is because of how we view the problem in the first place, and how, especially people in diaspora, when we think about landmines, we think about it in the context of a national security discourse. When people think about why the United States, Russia, South Korea, etc., haven't signed on to international treaties and accords, the rationale that's given has to do with national security. Well, we need it for anti-personal defense. We need it to protect our troops. We need it for, it's an important strategic tool in national security. And when landmines, the issue is being connected and discussed within this national security lens, it's never going to win in terms of activating the public imaginary for citizens in diaspora, because they're competing again with nuclear war. We're competing with other new conventional weapons like drones attacks, and we're competing with regional hotbeds, the Korean Peninsula, Afghanistan, Iraq. So and even the way we think about AIDS, etc., as this ongoing pandemic and the secularized rhetoric of biological and nuclear weapons, we're never going to think about it. Landmines is always going to lose a national security debate. So with this being the case, I still think it's important to separate fact and fiction. And the facts are, landmines, proper knowledge of landmines will actually show that it outweighs some of these security threats. Joseph Opong, who's a professor in North Texas, and Ezekiel Calpenny, which is actually an associate professor at my alma mater, University of Illinois, write in their 96 article called The Geography of Landmines and the Implications for Health and Disease in Africa, that most of these victims are civilians killed or injured after hostilities have endured. Of the 65 countries reported new landmine casualties from January 2002 through June 2003, 41 were at peace, not at war, and 85% of reported casualties were civilians. Between 1941 and 1996, landmines cause more deaths and injuries than nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons combined. Two things are important to note there. One, in the context of nuclear war, biological threats, the continued perpetuation of the war that was mentioned before perpetuates violence against the communities, but also landmines is not just continued landmine use and the destruction, is also a perpetuation of the war. And that's something I'm actually going to come back to later. So, reinventing the debate outside of nuclear war, nuclear discourse, and security rationale. I think one of the key ways and we can reorient this, and for the diaspora and African community and young individuals should talk about when we are advocating for these issues, is not just in strict security rationale, but instead in other things like public health. Landmines are a major public health concern both directly and indirectly. 140 million Africans are under threat of injury due to landmines, which is high or very high. As mentioned before, it affects water, agriculture development, health campaigns, and socio-economic emotional state for many inhabitants. It affects the entire well-being of African societies. It also affects other critical resources such as safe drinking water, arable land, and severely obstructs healthcare delivery. The same professor that talked before from the University of Illinois also goes on how it impacts healthcare systems. Landmine injury victims require nearly 3 times as many units of blood, 4 times as many surgical procedures, and longer hospital stays than patients with other war-related injuries. The increased frequency of blood transfusion also facilitates other types of diseases like syphilis, hepatitis, malaria, and HIV. There's also the ecological dimension of the landmine debate. It affects soil, flora, fauna, and different levels of the ecological system, whether landmines have been detonated or not, just because they're laying there and continuing to impact the land. It also affects other broad categories of the ecological environment, like access denial, loss of biodiversity, chemical contamination, loss of productivity, etc. Then another way to frame it outside of ecological and public health concerns is going to the topic at hand, which is education and the way that young people in Africa view themselves and the body. The impact of landmines is not just death, but it's social ostracization and dehumanization because of forced disabilities. And the way children and young people conceive of themselves on their way to class and the way they're treated in class. And I think that this is important going back to what was talking about learning communities and the way learning communities engage one each other and form those communities in which they can share information. The social perception of the disabled persons is more pernicious in Africa, especially because people who have disabilities are forced with sexual violence, disease, physical abuse, and will have little recourse available to them than other types of society. Also, we have the issue of how people perceive of themselves and their communities when they are constantly existing in a state of fear, forced to decide between starvation or risking death, caused by the denial of resources, creating perpetual conflicts and struggles. And when we have children trying to learn, trying to educate themselves, this is not the most conducive environment for learning. All of these things have an impact on education and all ways to frame the debate for the diaspora and as a young individual when we are approaching policymakers, when we are approaching the advocacy community, and where we're making our case. Now, I believe young people are the key to success. And I'm talking about everybody in the room who consider themselves men of the diaspora and wants to make change here. And I think we should consider the testimony of a 13-year-old boy from Kosovo whose story is told in Richard Norton Taylor's article, Cluster Bombs, The Hidden Toil. Here, Norton writes, the child writes, recounts his narrative saying, "I went with my cousins to see the place where NATO was bombed. As we walked, I saw something yellow. Someone told us it was a cluster bomb. One of us took it and put it into a well. Nothing happened. We began talking about taking the bomb and playing with it, and then I just put it somewhere and exploded. The boy near me died, and I was throwing a meter into the air. The boy who died was 14. His head was cut off. Now, the 13-year-old who recounts this story, both his hands and his legs were amputated. And when we think about some of these facts, the common response is that, well, it's war, and these are the casualties of war, and that in a war people die and things are broken. But in this case of landmines, where it affects children more specifically, it is a 14-year-old who dies and a 13-year-old who gets broken. So, young people. When we think about the African continent and young people, especially on the continent, 20% of the population is between 15 and 24 years old. 65% of the population is under the age of 30, and this is continuing to grow. And we think about not only those resources, but the emerging Afropolitans in the diaspora and how we can get engaged in this debate. And the key thing for me is reframing the terms, and I talked about some of the ways above that we can do this. We have to go look beyond the death tolls. Thinking about landmine casualties in purely statistical terms, in terms of body counts, is always misleading, and people in the diaspora, when we're advocating for change, will never win that debate. The mere threat of landmines makes daily life an exercise in paralyzing fear. It renders lands, roads, and public buildings useless, and that's something that some of these other things cannot compete with. So how should we frame our message? The first one is one of empowerment. And I think this is a really easy suggestion, and that is, if roads and fields can be used, Africa can feed itself. And this is something that a lot of the other campaigns in the international discourse can't claim. When you have millions of acres that can't be supplied or used to supply markets because of the fighting, and you have new roads that can be utilized, then we can get Africa to feed itself. And I think Angola is a great example. When before the war and prior to independence, Angola was actually the 4th largest coffee exporter, one of the largest staple food exporters in sub-Saharan Africa. But during the war, fields became empty, they were neglected or destroyed, and now Angola imports approximately half of its food supply. Stopping landmine use will help revive this industry, and with its huge farms, its fishing potential, and create jobs for a burgeoning middle class. Also, is the attention to structural violence. The tragic consequences of structural violence and poverty that's caused by landmine use because we can't rebuild infrastructure, it's hidden beneath the layers of culture and media's fascination with singular events of violence, what I was talking earlier, like the spectacle of nuclear war, or destruction based on other types of warfare. Every year, more than 15 million across the world die from malnutrition, preventable disease, and violence as a direct result of psychological and behavioral effects of poverty. Chris Kumo, who's an associate professor of philosophy and a member of the Women's Studies program at University of Cincinnati, goes into this a little bit more. They write, "The deadliest form of violence is poverty. An approach to a theory of violence needs to take a look at the structural violence. The lethal effects of structural violence operates continuously, whereas wars and other forms of behavioral violence occurs at one time. 14 to 18 million deaths a year are caused by structural violence, compared with about 100,000 deaths per year from armed conflict. We cannot continue to begin and compare structural violence, which continues year after year. Our current approaches to violence and the way we think about challenging these issues is always treating war as an event, or violence as an outbreak, with spatial boundaries, and peace as the absence of formal declaration of conflict. And this framework actively de-emphasizes the constant warfare against the periphery in the society. And I actually think that the conversation earlier is an example of that, because what was said was there were still disruptions, even though it was peacetime. But when we think about structural violence, it's thinking about it outside of just pure, here's peace and the declaration of war, but the violence and the war continuing. Landmines are a modern manifestation of warfare. The poverty they create and the massive number of civilian casualties they cause to go ignored because of violence they inflict occurs during what policymakers call peacetime. But right now, we're not seeing large-scale conventional war. We're seeing other things like dirty wars. We're seeing low-intensity wars. And here, we actually see the most civilian violence. 95% of civilian casualties by some estimates. So, going into positive peace. I believe for young individuals, as we frame our approaches, need to concentrate on a message of positive peace to avert annihilation. Peace shouldn't be conceived as violence, the absence of violence in all its forms, physical, social, psychological, and structural. Peace is the mere absence of war, and the controlling of violence has a negative idea of peace that does not deal with the causes of violence, but only its manifestations. Positive peace, in contrast, involves a search for positive conditions which can resolve underlying causes of conflict that produce violence. Also, the stories we tell and the new social media allows